Pragmatists. What do they say about the relation between a thought and the thing the thought is about? Hilary Putnam frames the pragmatist question quite nicely. He says, there are these objects out there. Here is the mind carrying on its thinking. How do the thinker's symbols get into a unique correspondence with objects and sets out there? How do the thinker's symbols get into a unique correspondence with objects and sets out there? Now, it's very important to notice that in framing the question in this way, we are introducing a new assumption, an assumption that we haven't so far made. And that assumption is that there are something like a thinker's symbols, ideas. It's worth pausing over this assumption just to really spell it out, to be really clear about the new idea that we're introducing. I might think, that tiger looks fierce. And you might think, no wonder, Steve, the baby of that tiger is only 6 months. So here are two thoughts. They're both thoughts about a tiger. The idea here is that those thoughts have constituents, components. One of them corresponds to the tiger, and that's a component of both thoughts. That's why Putnam's talking about symbols, or other people might talk about ideas, the idea of the tiger. So these are a kind of analogue of words. If we consider those two sentences that you see here on the screen, just looking at the sentences, you can see that there's a common element to both. The word tiger, the word there is repeated. Now, the assumption that we're making, if we accept this way of setting up the question, the pragmatist way of setting up about correspondence, is that where I'm thinking about tigers, there is an idea in me, and that idea is a feature of all of my thoughts about tigers. Now, it seems like perhaps a very small deal, but we'll see that that makes quite a difference. Very good. Now, I want to carry on emphasising this. I want to draw a contrast between Putnam's way of setting things up and the way that I was setting things up thus far. So I've been asking this question over here again. What sort of relation between a subject and an object has to obtain if the subject is able to think about the object? And what you note here is that in my way of setting up the question so far, we haven't made any assumptions at all about ideas or symbols or anything else in the thinker's head. We've talked about relation between the subject and the object. So what I'm stressing for you is that if we go with Putnam's way of phrasing the question, we're introducing a new element. We're introducing the idea that there is a mental counterpart of the tiger, or of the thing about which you're thinking. There's a mental counterpart of the thing about which you're thinking. I'll say that again, I'm sorry, I messed it up. In setting the question up in Putnam's way, we're introducing the idea that there is a mental counterpart of the tiger, or of the thing about which you are thinking. That's the idea, or as Putnam says, the symbol. Very good. So, the next thing I want to do is to just show you that Putnam's way of thinking about things is genuinely in line with what the classical pragmatists, Peirce, James and Dewey, held. Now that's important because Putnam sets things up in terms of correspondence, and there's been a sort of myth creation by more contemporary philosophers who suggested that pragmatists reject the very idea of correspondence. This is in fact untrue. That's not a pragmatist view at all. That's contemporary philosophers trying to borrow a famous name for some views which are quite different from the historical views. We shouldn't allow that. So here's Peirce. Peirce says that truth is the correspondence of a representation with its object is merely the nominal definition of it. But what does this correspondence or reference of the sign to its object consist in? So what you can see here is that Peirce is very, very far from rejecting the idea about correspondence. Peirce, like Putnam, accepts the idea of correspondence, but rightly notes that talking about correspondence tells us nothing at all about the nature of truth or about the nature of thought. The substantive issue, this was the great pragmatist insight, the substantive issue is to understand what this correspondence consists in. So Peirce. Marvellous. Okay. Now we're going to move over to another pragmatist, another of the classical pragmatists. This is William James, a photo taken of him when he was touring in Brazil. What does James say? He says, I say that we know an object by means of an idea. Here's one of those thinker symbols. Whenever we ambulate towards the object under the impulse which the idea communicates. You notice that there's no acquaintance here. James's suggestion is we know an object, we're able to think about it by means of an idea. Whenever that idea is something that takes us to the object, it communicates an impulse, takes us to the object. James goes on and gives us a nice example. He doesn't go on actually, this is from earlier in the same work. He says, the pointing of our thought to tigers is known simply and solely as a procession of mental associates and motor consequences that follow on the thought. And that would lead harmoniously, if followed out, into some ideal or real context, or even into the immediate presence of tigers. He goes, oh, I find this really compelling. It's even known, if we take the tigers very seriously, as actions of ours which may terminate in directly intuited tigers, as they would if we took a voyage to India for the purpose of tiger hunting and brought back a lot of the skins of the striped rascals which we had laid low. I guess you couldn't get away with saying that these days, but this was of course 1909, quite a while ago that James was writing this. Now, apart from this lovely metaphor of striped rascals, I take it the crucial idea here is that we have an alternative to a view like Russell's on acquaintance. The idea that James is making so vivid for us is this. In order for you to be able to think thoughts about tigers, you need to have an idea in you, but not just any old idea. You need to have an idea which will take you to a tiger, will draw you towards it. Now, I said when I was explaining the plan for this week that we'd only be looking at the pragmatist view in a very superficial way. Surely it's very difficult to make James's idea here into some sort of full-blown theory about thought. That would be a pretty major undertaking. All I'm after here is that we've got the basic idea. What is James trying to tell us? What's the rough direction that he's going in? Hopefully you get that from these two quotes here. So let's take a look at the pragmatist view. On the pragmatist view, there is nothing more primitive than thought which explains the possibility of thought. Rather, the idea is that thoughts have constituents, they're composed of ideas, and those ideas link to objects by taking us to the object, by causing us to act in ways that will bring us to the object. On this view then, awareness of things plays no role at all in explaining the possibility of thought, and finally, we have to accept that there are something like ideas or symbols in a thinker's head. There is a psychological component common to all the thoughts about tigers, and this is the idea of tigers. So the pragmatist view. Now we can contrast that with what I'll call the acquaintance view. This is a view that I've borrowed from my own interpretation of Russell. You could say it's a sort of not an entirely true interpretation of Russell. I've selected some bits of it. It's a creative misinterpretation of Russell. On the acquaintance view, there is something more primitive than thought, namely acquaintance. Acquaintance explains the possibility of thought. Here's my regular friend the puffin. Your acquaintance with puffin is what explains your ability to think thoughts about the puffin. On the pragmatist view, there's no counterpart. There's an idea of puffin in you, and that idea causes you to ambulate towards puffin, and therefore provides a connection between you and the puffin. That's quite different from the acquaintance view, where that relation of acquaintance, probably a perceptual relation to the puffin, enables you to think. The second thing to note is that because acquaintance is thought of as a matter of, in one way or another, being aware of an object through perception or memory paradigmatically, on the acquaintance view, awareness of things plays an indispensable role in explaining the possibility of thought. And then finally, on the acquaintance view, it's only the tigers themselves that are common to all thoughts about tigers. When we're thinking in terms of the acquaintance view, there is no need for us to postulate ideas or any other psychological component which corresponds somehow to the tigers. That's one of the features that's missing from the acquaintance view. So I introduced the pragmatist view because I wanted to get onto the table one alternative to the acquaintance view, to show you that we're in no way forced to accept the acquaintance view. Pragmatist view, I haven't told you, of course, how that could be worked out in detail. And indeed, I would think that's something that's highly controversial and very difficult to do. But of course, the same is going to be said for the acquaintance view as well. We're looking at these two views both in a fairly sketchy way. What I want to suggest is that we've got at least two possible views about the nature of thought on the table, and we shouldn't feel that there's any obvious compulsion to accept one of these views or to start with it. Good. So where are we here? My overall question for this part of the course, and the main question for the whole course, is about a particular fact to be explained. The fact is that there are many, many objects in the universe, and there are only a few of those that you can think about. You can think about some objects, but not others, and I want to know, why is that? Why is that? What makes the difference between the objects you can think about and the objects you can't think about? I don't think it's the shape of the object. I don't think that I could explain this by saying, well, you know, you can think about square objects but not about round objects. That doesn't make any sense to me at all. I think it's something to do with the relation between you and the object. But when I'm looking for answers to this question, I then see that there are a multiplicity of different views. And so far we've looked at two. We've looked at the acquaintance view, which says that the reason why you can think about some objects but not others is that you're acquainted with some of the objects, or you know them by description. That extra bit. And what we've just seen is the pragmatist view, which says the reason why you can think about some objects but not others is because you have an idea, a mental counterpart of the object in you, and the idea is one which takes you to that object in some way, takes you to the object. Those are the two views.